Hi there, welcome back to the Flask Mastery series. I'm Gorret, and in this session we are going to implement the authentication process by verifying the identity of the user against their credentials. Since our Authors API is going to contain valuable information, we have to ensure that only authorized users can access it. We will be implementing the access tokens and discussing why they are crucial for maintaining the security of our API. So grab your favorite coding beverage and let's get started. The authentication process in terms of user login works in a way that a user logs in with their email and password, for example. Then his or her credentials are verified against credentials that are stored in the database. And for our case, if the credentials are correct, we will generate an access token for the user. I know you would be wondering what an access token is, but an access token is a unique string of characters that serves as a credential and grants a user access to specific resources. The access token contains a user's identity, thus enabling them to access protected routes or protected resources in the API without them providing their email and password, for example, for each request, and this enhances security in a way that it reduces the risk of these credentials for the user being intercepted. So we will be protecting our books and company resources in the future from unauthorized users. Well, let's now put the theory into practice. So first, to be able to generate the access tokens for our API, we are going to work with the Flask JWT extended library. So I'll head over to its official documentation, and under the installation, I'll make sure that I'm copying the command that installs this library. Then within our project, I'll ensure that we are installing it and making sure that the virtual environment is activated first. Then I'll run the command. So under the basic usage of this library, we can see that we always need to create a new instance from the JWT manager class. So I'm going to copy this, and then within our app package, then the extensions, I'm going to make sure that we are importing Flask JWT from the JWT manager, and we need to go ahead and create a new instance. So I'll make sure that I update its constructor. So having created a new object of the JWT manager class, we now have to go ahead and register the object within our application factory function. So I'll make sure that from our extensions file, we are importing the JWT object that we have created, and we shall initialize it against our app instance. So jwt.initApp, then we pass in the app variable. So within our auth controller, we are going to go ahead and create a function that is going to help us perform the task of logging in users based on their identity. So first things first, we shall of course need to work with the route decorator, and since we are using the blueprint, so this is going to be decorated with the auth blueprint. Then the method we are going to use for logging in is going to be post, and we need to pass in a URL as the parameter for this function. So the URL is going to be /login, and then the function is not going to have parameters for now. So since we work with the request response cycle, we first of all need to keep track of the request values that are going to come from the request body for this case. So we are going to log in the users using their email address and their password. So I'll go ahead and define variables like the email. Then we access the request object. So request.json.get, then we are getting the key for the email, And I'm going to go ahead and copy this such that we cater for the password too. So I'm going to ensure that we are also working with the error handling by using the try and except block. And for now we can pass this, and we go ahead and bring in the except against the exception interrupt as E for the error, such that we return a JSONified response in case we have any errors. So this enables us to catch any errors that arise during the process of testing this endpoint. So make sure that we are returning the error key, and then the value for this, I'll first of all ensure that we are casting it to a string and then passing it in. And of course, whenever we are catching errors, that means that we are working with an internal server error. So I'll go ahead and copy this status code and ensure that we are returning it for this case. Now within our try block, we want to add the logic that logs in a user. So first of all, we have to ensure that we are validating the data in a way that we make sure that the email and the password are required. So I'll go ahead and add an if condition. If not the password or not the email address, then return a response to the user that the email and the password are required. So if not password or not the email, then we are going to go ahead and return a JSONified response. Then I pass in the message, email and password are required. And for each response, we have to go ahead and return a status code. And for this case, it's going to be a 400 status code, meaning that it's a bad request. So I will also ensure that we are importing it. So I'll make sure that we add it too. So I'll go ahead and copy this and then paste it here. So having ensured that we are receiving the password and the email address from the user, we have to go ahead and make a query to the database and ensure that the email address that is being provided by the user at that time exists in the database. So I'll create a variable user, then I assign it to the result that is going to come from the query against our user model. And since we are using an object relational mapper, we work with a query dot filter by, and we are filtering against the email address column and passing in the email value that is coming from the request. So this will be equal to the email. And then you want to go ahead and make sure that we are making the query against the first record. So I'll pass in the first function. So if the user exists, we want to go ahead and perform different logic. Else, we want to go ahead and return a different response for this case, in a way that we let the user know that their email address is invalid or does not exist. So I'll just return a simple response, and we can say this message such that the value for this case is an invalid email address. And whenever the email address is invalid, then that means that we haven't authorized our user yet. So make sure that we are returning a status code of 401 for an unauthorized user. So I'll make sure that we are also importing this status code such that we add it here for this response. So if the user exists, we have to ensure that the email address that the user has provided is valid for the password that they have also submitted. So for this case, with the fact that we actually hashed the passwords during the registration process, we want to ensure that we first of all check the password that is being provided at this time against what was stored in the database. I'm actually going to create a Boolean variable that is going to cater for this. So is correct password. So bcrypt provides the check password hash that can be used to ensure that the password that is being provided by the user is the same password that was hashed in the database. So bcrypt dot check password hash, and the check password hash, the first parameter we pass in is the hashed password that is stored in our database. So we know that if this is the user, we want to access their hashed password. So user dot password, then we pass in the password that is being provided at this time, which is the password variable. So since this variable is a Boolean, we want to ensure that if the variable is correct, if it actually returns true for the Boolean value, then we want to ensure that we are logging in the user and also creating an access token. So the access token, I'll just go ahead and create a simple variable to store the access token. And for us to be able to create the access token, since we are working with the Flask JWT package, we want to ensure that we are importing the create access token from Flask JWT extended. So from Flask JWT extended, we import the create access token such that we now invoke this create access token function. So the access tokens must always be unique, and that means that we have to go ahead and pass in a particular identity for each access token. And for this case, we can now pass in the identity in a way that we are using the user's ID. So this user, so we access that user variable, then we know that this user is going to have an ID, so we can work with the identity in a way that we are passing in the user ID. And having created the access token, we are now going to go ahead and return a response. And for this case, I'm going to ensure that we are returning the user alongside the user details. So we shall need to return the user ID, then the username. So we know that we have a function that returns the username of a user, whereby it concatenates the last name and the first name. And these were actually defined on our model. So we can just refer to this. So we have to access the get full name. So user dot get full name. So we can also go ahead and return the user email address that they have used for this authentication process. And this is going to be user dot the email. And we can also return the access token. And the value for the access token is going to be the variable that we have defined here. So I'll copy this and ensure that I'm pasting it here. So having returned this response, of course, we have to go ahead and return a status code. And for this case, having successfully logged in a user, the status code is going to be 200. So I'll ensure that we have this status code. So I'll make sure that I am also importing the HTTP 200 status code. And I'll go ahead and paste it here. So cases whereby the email address is actually valid, but the password is not the right password that is stored in the database, we have to go ahead and return a different response. So else, we shall now return, I'll first of all copy this so that we'll use it here. So the response for this is going to be an invalid password. Invalid password. And still the status code is going to remain a 401 in a way that still the user is not going to be authorized. So we are now going to go ahead and test our application. So before we actually test our application, we need to add a secret key. So I'll go ahead and copy this. So I'll make sure that we are registering the JWT secret key within our config class. And the value of this, of course, can be something different, not this. So for now, I'll just update this to author. So I'll make sure that our application is running. So we are now going to head over to Postman so that we can test our endpoint. So within this folder for the auth, I'm going to go ahead and create a new request. So add request. And then the request name is going to be login. Actually, it can be user login. So I'll actually just copy this so that we'll use it here. So the URL for this is auth/login. And the method is going to be the post method. And since it is a post method, then that means that we need a request body. Not forgetting that the content type must also be updated. So the content type must be of type JSON. So application/JSON. And then the body for this case, actually we can copy what we had here. So for this case, we are going to log in a user using the email address and the password. So I'll actually update this so that we can try to test and see if we can be able to log in the admin. So I'm actually going to first delete the password key and value, and we see whether we are able to return a response in a way that all the fields are required. So I'll send a request. So we can see that email and password are required, and this is true. So I'll do a Ctrl+Z for this case to ensure that we are passing in the password. So when I make a new request, we can actually see that we are returning a response and the status code is okay. And we are actually creating an access token. And we can see that it is always a mixture of different string characters. And for this case, we actually returned the email address, the ID of the user, and the same applies to the username. So within our database, we can actually see that we are having the system admin, and this is the email address for the system admin, and the ID of the system admin is 7, which is actually true. So to some point, you can also always return the user type. So if we actually update this to also have the user type, so after the access token, we can add the type of the user, and this is going to be the user object, then dot the type. Okay, so having updated this, I'm going to go ahead and retest, make a new request. User object has no attribute type. Oh, my bad. So actually, the property is user type. So I'm going to go ahead and make a new request. So you can actually see that we are returning the access token for the user, their email address, the ID and the type, as well as the username. And also to improve the user experience, I'm going to go ahead and return a message for this response. So I'm going to add a comma here, such that we return a key for the message. And the value for the message is going to be, you have successfully logged into your account. So I'm going to go ahead and rerun the application so that we retest the endpoint. So I'll make a new request. So we can see that we are having the message within our response and also the user object. I hope you found this session helpful. Thanks for watching and see you again in the next session.